are you good at sex? The way that we frame this question already tells us a lot about how we think sex is supposed to be. The first thing I need to say is that the whole good at sex thing, wow, that misses the point. Sex isn't a transferable skill from one relationship to the next. Being good at sex means being fully in the moment and able to laugh when something funny happens. Sex is often very funny. Welcome to The Intimate Philosopher, where philosophy meets intimacy and life's biggest questions finally feel at home. I'm Dr. Emma Smith. I'm a licensed professional counselor, certified sex therapist, and existential philosophy nerd, inviting you to join me for an after-hours conversation. This is a space to slow down, pour a glass of wine, or maybe a cup of tea, and explore the messy, beautiful intersections of meaning, connection, desire, and being fully human. This is the place for real conversations about the parts of life that don't fit neatly into a box. So, grab your glass, get comfy, and let's dive in. Hi, friends. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and he asked me a question, half curious, half bashful. And it's a question that I think a lot of people wonder quietly when they meet a sex therapist, maybe not so quietly. But he asked me, are you good at sex? What struck me first is I wonder how many people actually walk around asking this. And in fact, the other day saw a friend of mine who's also a sex therapist who talked about like how once a month or once a week we'll get somebody who thinks that being a sex therapist means that you watch people have sex and like give them pointers. And I thought this was hilarious because it is absolutely not what we do. But anyway, there's this question of, are you good at sex? And what struck me wasn't the question itself, but like how much weight it actually carries. And yes, this is going to be one of those moments where I take something that was probably meant a little cheeky and I make a deep dive about it. And I'm sorry to my friend if you're listening and you go, oh my God, I can't believe you did a whole episode about this one question that I asked. But I think it's important. And it's not like he's the first person that ever asked me about this. Questions like this so rarely have anything to do with technique or performance, and they're usually about something that is so much more vulnerable and tender underneath. And it really, I think what people are often asking is, am I doing this right? Or is there something I'm missing? Can someone tell me what actually works? Because all I care about is, doing it well. And if you've ever felt uncertain or anxious or in your head about sex, which probably most of us have at some point, or maybe it's not even just about sex, but just about relationships more broadly, I want you to know that that makes sense. And it makes sense in particular because it's where it lives in our culture. I mean, it is a place where shame, expectation, desire, and identity all collide. And of course, we want clarity there. And so I've learned after years of working with real people in real relationships that the most helpful conversations, they don't start with quick answers. They start with questions that help you understand yourself more clearly. So in this episode, I want to talk about why questions matter so much in my work and how I think about sex and intimacy and what this space is really about. And I want to name this clearly. This is a foundational episode. So if you want to understand how I think and how I work and what you can expect from this podcast, this is the place to start. So I think that one of the places that I want to start with this is talking about how some of my work might feel different than what a lot of people are used to, especially when we're talking about, podcast episode format. I typically do not answer questions like the are you good at sex with rules or absolutes. And I don't hand out formulas for how sex or relationships or desire should look. I'm really interested in questions and in context and in helping people more closely understand themselves rather than outsourcing their knowing to someone else. And so in this episode, in addition to kind of exploring a little bit more about the question at hand, I also want to talk about why I feel like it's so important to resist definitive answers, how that shapes my work as a sex therapist, and what it might invite you to consider about how you relate to sex, certainty, and your own inner authority. I hope that you'll walk away today with a clearer understanding of why certainty can get in the way of intimacy and how learning to ask better questions can help you trust yourself more and create better relationships with the people you're actually sleeping with. Okay, so let's start with the question itself. Are you good at sex? Because the way that we frame this question already tells us a lot about how we think sex is supposed to be. And the first thing I need to say is that the whole good at sex thing, wow, that misses the point. Sex isn't a transferable skill from one relationship to the next. I mean, what feels good is contextual and highly personal and should be negotiated and also evolving. And then if you think about it, presence and humor and flexibility and repair, I think all of those matter more than technique, because being good at sex means being fully in the moment and able to laugh when something funny happens, because guess what? Sex is often very funny, and not letting hiccups kill the vibe, whether that is literal actual hiccups or when something doesn't go as planned. And for that matter, being bad at sex, the way that I think that people talk about it often comes down to being human. If you don't know what somebody wants because you haven't had the conversation, well, that's not you being bad at sex. That's you having some lackluster communication skills. Right. And so I think that feeling shy or nervous or self-conscious or awkward is reasonable, especially while you're naked. For what it's worth, from my lens, the people who are bad at sex aren't the ones who are less technically well-versed. They're the people who don't care about their partner and their partner's pleasure, and they aren't curious about what might feel good for their partner. And they're the ones that respond with criticism or judgment when something goes wrong. Or I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but if you've ever had sex with somebody who seemed to be running off a script in their head instead of being in the moment with the person in front of them, that gets weird. So again, it's not about technique. It's about curiosity. I am going to pause here for a second, because sometimes when I talk about alignment or presence, people worry that I'm about to make things way more complicated or less concrete. And the truth is that, again, I'm not here to hand you rules or universal answers about sex, not because those questions aren't valid, but because I've seen how quickly those questions can pull people away from their own knowing or exploration, or even their own liking for that matter. My focus is to help you understand your desires, your values, and your patterns, so that the answers that you land on actually fit your life and hopefully lead you into the direction of, in this case, a sex life that you would actually want to show up for and participate in. So that doesn't mean that I'm going to stay vague. Okay. That means that I'm going to stay honest and contextual and make sure that things are grounded in lived experience. And so what you get out of this time together isn't a list of rules. It's a way to think about sex and relationships that helps you hear yourself more clearly and make choices that actually fit. And now, don't get it twisted. I am full of little suggestions for things to try, because as your bestie turned sex therapist extraordinaire, I do know a thing or two about things that you can try and conversations that you can have. And I'm happy to share all of that with you. But I want it to be framed more as permission slips for your own curiosity than prescriptions that say, if you do this thing, you will produce this result. Got it? Okay. I think this is important because once we understand that most people aren't looking for perfection, but rather for reassurance, then you can start to hear, when we go back to that original question of, so are you good at sex? I think that one of the questions underneath is, can you tell me what's right? And that's more about naming this desire to please and just like calling it out. Most people will look to experts for answers because uncertainty is uncomfortable. And there's plenty of times where you want to go to experts about things because uncertainty can be dangerous. But in things that are very subjective, especially when we're talking about pleasure, okay, uncertainty is uncomfortable. Now, that said, there are some behaviors and certain sexual practices that can be more risky. And so, absolutely, you want to know what you're doing. And over the course of our time together, I will bring on different experts from niche spaces to be able to have some of these conversations because they're so important. But also, before we even get anywhere around there, I think it's important to also acknowledge that sex still carries a lot of stigma and shame and performance anxiety for a lot of people. I mean, think about it. Sex is still, in many ways, considered dirty, bad, disgusting, perverse. You can't even say the word on some platforms. I have a PhD and I have to figure out how to say, segs in order to talk about my work on some social media. And so you have this stigma and this shame and this like dirty, bad, disgusting, perverse word, but also you have to do this thing well. And by the way, we're not going to give you any instruction and we're not going to teach you anything about it or how to do it safely. And we're not even going to use the real names for your body parts. But also, at the same time, there is something wrong with you if you aren't confidently able to perform on demand and for the person that you love. So, wham bam, like, of course, people are craving advice because advice promises relief, even at the cost of maybe some agency or curiosity. And so, I get it, but that desire for certainty, it ends up being limiting, even when it makes sense. So when people ask, can you tell me what's right? I get it. No one's being lazy and no one's being naive. They're, I think, responding to real confusion and lack of education and real pressure. And that's exactly why there are voices in our culture who step in and offer some clear, definitive guidance about sex. And that kind of advice serves a very real purpose. And believe me, I understand its appeal. It also comes from a very different function from the work that I do. And the difference is what I want to talk about next. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between definitive advice and lived experience. Some voices are trying to shape culture, and there are others, like myself, who are working with lived experience. Now, neither is inherently better, but they are doing very different jobs. So when you think about culture shaping voices, think about Dan Savage, Lisa Mangaldes, maybe Emily Morsi. There's others out there too. They are really kind of aimed at efficiency and scale. And they are culture shaping and giving, new vocabulary. And it is such a wonderful service. And I'm so, so, so glad that we have it. Therapy, on the other hand, and I think working with lived experience is really about holding space for the fact that contradictions exist and context and relational nuance can really change almost everything. And what helps one person may actually harm another. Efficiency is, I think, an admirable thing to chase in many ways, but it's also not a neutral value, and it doesn't have to be the highest one. There's kind of this idea of form following function, and my function isn't to shape culture. It's to help people hear themselves. And here's where that really starts to matter, because the way that advice is delivered, especially when it comes from authority, it doesn't just shape understanding, it shapes what people feel allowed to question. And I want you to feel allowed to question everything, absolutely everything. So you might be sitting here going like, wow, you really have some big feelings, Emma, about why absolutes seem to end conversations. And yeah, I do. I think that things like authority and certainty can flatten complexity. And I think that, Absolutes can feel grounding, but they can also shut down exploration. When experts speak definitively, especially when they're talking about people they've never met, and I can't speak to the hard sciences. I can only speak to the relational, psychological sciences. I think that what ends up happening is that when we speak too definitively about something, our clients or our audience, whoever's listening to us, can tend to defer instead of reflect on what they've heard and figure out like, oh, does this fit for me? That's why I say I'll never tell you what to do. If you ever run into any of my clients in the wild and they say, she told me what to do, you will know that that is not true. They are not my client, because all of my clients will tell you, oh, that girl would never tell me what to do. She would always say, I'll invite you to consider. Why? Because questions invite and support agency, and as far as like science goes, I've been in this field long enough to watch science evolve, right? Things that we used to think and held true previously, we no longer hold as true. So it is what it is. We just try to hold those conclusions lightly. So, I do back my work with science when it's available, but I don't try. I really try to not confuse evidence with eternal, unchanging truth. So, with that in mind, what the heck do we do instead? Well, this is kind of the core of my whole mission here, is to talk about process over conclusions. And don't get me wrong, like, I have this existential lens. I really do view the world in terms of meaning and purpose, and these existential givens of we're born and then we're going to die, and we strive for connection and we wrestle with isolation and, meaning versus meaninglessness, and where's our purpose and everything. There's these big, big questions. And then there's also people that I've been lucky enough to work with for almost 14 years and watching this process over and over again. And here's the other thing, is that nobody comes to me clinically. No one is coming to me for my opinions. They are there for clarity. They're there for some nerdy tools that I, ended up with a ton of student loans in order to be able to give people. And while I do disclose enough to hopefully be human, I hold a perspective, but I'm never going to declare that perspective the truth. It is a perspective. So as I'm sitting here and I'm reflecting on this, I think really, if you leave with nothing else, realizing that, I'm not trying to help people think like me. I'm trying to help people think more clearly as themselves. And if there's one thread that's running through all of this, it's that clarity doesn't come from someone else holding the truth for you. It's about learning how to stay present with yourself long enough to hear what's already inside you. And that's the kind of work that I care about. And that's the kind of conversation I want to keep having here. So I can't wait to go on this journey with you. And I hope you are here for the long haul. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for joining me for this after hours conversation. If something in today's episode made you pause, get curious, or see yourself a little more clearly, share it with a friend and keep that conversation going. Until next time, keep exploring that messy, beautiful space between meaning and being human. I'll see you next time.